apologies for not showing up on time, and just got in the wrong time zone and just didn't make this switch in my brain. So what I'm going to do is pick up from a presentation I gave at the Northern Plains meeting about 1.5 years ago. I've thrown a few extra slides in there, and this is going to be a lot more than we can cover in like 10 or 12 minutes. And so being at the end of the program, maybe I can get away with talking a little bit more than otherwise. And if somebody has to leave, that's perfectly fine with me. But I just want to cover a number of things with biochar, what it is, how it's made, what it can do as a soil amendment, as a feed supplement, and from the standpoint of carbon storage. And then answer the rhetorical question, why isn't everybody doing it? And some long-term thoughts as well. So basically, starting at the beginning, biochar is an easy way to think of it as charcoal, but it's made from biomass. And as you know, charcoal, some of the charcoal you can buy at the store is made from coal. So people invented the word biochar just to distinguish that from coal char. It can be made from almost any organic material, feedstocks such as residues from forestry and agriculture. Wood, straw, and manure are the typical ones we think of. And it's produced by pyrolysis and or gasification. And these are two techniques that are not that different. They're just different parts of what you might even consider the combustion cycle. And I'm not going to dwell on that too much, just so you know that when you hear the terms, you don't get too freaked out. I think the other thing is that, as shown in the picture on the right, biochar is not a single thing. It comes in all kinds of shapes and forms and sizes and has different properties. It's just it's charcoal made from biomass by any number of techniques. And so, although we talk about it as if it were a single thing, it's actually more of a product from a process or that can be highly variable. So try not to think of it as something that's just one thing. I'm going to just blow your mind real quickly here just to get you the idea. You start off with this unaltered plant material here. It has 3 major components. You heat it up different temperatures and it converts to something totally different. And this is what we call the charcoal, and it's more like graphite by the time we're done with it. It's little bitty crystallites of graphite. And there's some amorphous carbon in there. But point is, once you get above this 600 to 800 degrees thing, you transform the original material completely over to a new form of carbon, and you get rid of a lot of carbon. Down at the bottom here, you see how much weight you started with. As you go through this process, most of it goes out the stack, and the top is CO2, and you end up with some charcoal. It's what we call fixed carbon down here at the bottom. You end up with some ash, which is the original mineral material in the plants. And there's what we call volatile matter, which is sort of like this amorphous stuff that's fairly easily degradable by microorganisms and goes away fairly quickly. But the black stuff is the stuff that sticks around a long time. And that's the stuff people like to think about, particularly when we're talking about climate change. So how is it made? As I mentioned, pyrolysis is one of the ways, and there's both slow and fast pyrolysis. And I won't dwell too much on it other than to say that this is a fairly complicated slow pyrolysis method. You can also make it in a big pit in the ground, or have a little kiln that people can carry and transport. It's called an Oregon kiln or a flame-capped kiln. So, but the idea is pyrolysis is nothing more than the breaking down of matter by applying heat. And so, as I showed in that earlier slide, you're just transforming it, but you're transforming it slowly. And when you do that, you end up with more biochar. If you transform it quickly, where the heating rate of the material is very fast, like in a matter of a few seconds, Then you shock it and you generate more oil, and you generate bio oil. And so a lot of people have gone down the idea of making bio oil, which can then be refined and used for fuel. Raw bio oil is basically the equivalent of bunker fuel, but it has its issues. And these are much more complicated systems because you got to refine it before you can use it. So I'm a big fan of salt pyrolysis because it maximizes the biochar production and minimizes these oils. And in fact, it basically cleans them up, burns them up in the process. And a common way of making biochar is actually what we call gasification, where you actually have oxygen present. So you're actually combusting to some extent. And here's a backyard biochar production unit, the gasifier. And so the air comes in here and here, and you have an afterburner, and you can see it cleans this up so the flame burns quite cleanly. This down here in the bottom left is what we call an air curtain burner or air curtain incinerator. And the Forest Service uses these a lot to just get rid of biomass. It can go through like, I think 10 tons an hour or something like that. And basically the idea is you have this big blower that blows air across the top and down in and mixes it up. And again, it burns very cleanly. You have minimal amounts of soot and methane coming off, and you can get rid of a lot of biomass very quickly. So if your whole point is just getting rid of biomass, this is the perfect solution. But the problem with this is that most of it ends up going back into the atmosphere. So if you're thinking about making biochar, then you need to get away from this a little bit. Here's a multi-million-dollar gasifier that's sold, and this one generates energy as well. And so Phoenix Energy is a 500 kilowatt unit installed in California. So the ways of making biochar range from extremely simple to extremely complex, and the different combinations of biochar and gases and oils and that sort of thing. And then it can also be made by a wood boiler with a typical bioenergy plant. And in fact, most of the biochar that is sold in this country right now comes from a facility that looks like this. Basically, it's a bioenergy facility, but they capture their fly ash, and normally they would just recycle it back into their burner. These are the things that capture the fly ash, but normally they'd cycle it back into their burner and just get the energy out of it. But what they've been doing now is, instead of cycling it back into their burner, they take the fly ash, they separate out the mineral part of it, the heavy ash falls out, and they end up with biochar. It's very nice stuff. And it's very economical. So, like I say, it's very easy. These guys have more production capacity than there is demand at the moment. And perhaps as biochar becomes more popular, then we'll be finding some of these other methods will come into the fore. But right now, most of it is made by facilities like this. And the nice thing is you can go back and forth between maximizing your bioenergy production, making electricity, or turning around and maximizing your biochar production. So what is it itself? This is on the right is just a picture of it's a microscope picture of what an inside of a biochar particle looks like. And this is some kind of a wood biochar, probably a hardwood. And it's got these large pores here, large relatively speaking. These are probably in the order of tens of microns across. And so they serve to retain water. They serve to store air. They serve as little homes for fungi and soil microorganisms, and it's just a lot of surface area here. And basically, it's like biochar is adding a new surface when you put it in the soil. It's like adding a new mineral. You all of a sudden have this new surface, and it serves as a template for soil organic carbon that would be produced by roots and microorganisms. Instead of just being consumed or washed out of the profile, it'll actually stick to the surface. And so one of the neat things about biochar, and it's really only become appreciated in the last few years, is it actually increases the rate of soil organic matter formation. And I'll talk about that a little bit later here. Anyway, getting back to the fact that biochar is all kinds of different chars, they all depend on what feedstock you start with and what conditions you make it. But typically they have 60 to 80% carbon, whereas the biomass might only have 50% carbon. And if you're dealing with manure, it might only have 25%. It has a high carbon content. When produced at the higher temperatures, like in a gasifier, it's stable for centuries, perhaps even longer, has a high porosity. Right as it's made, it typically has a high pH. So that's great if you have an acid soil and you're looking to lime your soil, then biochar is a great amendment. If you have a soil like many of the soils out here in the West, where they're already pH 7.5 or 8, the last thing you probably want to do is add biochar straight out of the hopper. So you can adjust it during the manufacture by putting steam. The steam will react with the surface and oxidize it and create acid functional groups on it. Or you can co-compost it. And in California, most of the biochar sold is co-composted biochar. It helps the composting process, and it helps the biochar sort of mellow out a bit and gets rid of the high pH problem. As I mentioned, it can store water and nutrients. You can think of it as being similar to activated charcoal or activated carbon. So a lot of people will make this as a cheap form of that and use it for grabbing metals from runoff and things like that. And it does bind metals. It also binds organic contaminants. And this is an issue if you're applying herbicides to your field or pesticides. The biochar, they may stick to the biochar instead of doing what you want them to do. And so that can be where it can be a drawback. But on the other hand, if you don't want it to wash off your place and go into the stream or the neighbor's field, it's nice to have a border strip around your field that would do this to capture these things. So what does it do for climate change? This is a fairly simple diagram, just shows the normal carbon cycle, which you're probably all familiar with. Carbon CO2 is captured from photosynthesis to produce biomass, and it decomposes or burns, and basically 99% of it or more goes back into the atmosphere, and that's sort of the normal carbon cycle. What biochar does is it intercepts this cycle by this pyrolysis or gasification approach. Under optimal conditions, you can get about half of the carbon stored in the biochar. And this biochar is going to be around a lot longer than this biomass would have been. And so that's the advantage. You're siphoning it off. So you also can create energy from it with this gas that comes off of the bio-oil. And then the net thing is you have 50% less CO2 going into the atmosphere, more of this carbon stays in the ground as biochar, and then you have these other benefits that I mentioned as well. So a biochar will be basically have a lifetime about 20 times greater than the wood from which it's made. Wood is the feedstock, and 200 to 500 times greater if straw is the feedstock. And if you're making it under controlled conditions, then you get a much higher carbon efficiency and a higher quality than you do with the natural charcoal from wildfire, which has variable temperatures and may not be as stable, and it's not as reliable. Not that we're going to not that we like wildfires all the time in wrong places anyway. But so it can serve as a way of taking the natural fire cycle and improving on it to store more carbon as charcoal and biochar, and also have it there for a longer period of time. I've done some work in Washington State, just looking at how much it can offset. And this is looking at wheat straw primarily, wood waste recovered from municipal sources and green waste, and then residual forest biomass, what's left over after they harvest the trees for other purposes. And over here, we've modeled basically the enhanced yield. When you put it back in an agronomic soil and agricultural situation, you should get a boost in your yield. And that's typically, it varies. Sometimes you don't see this, but on average, it might be about 10% boost in your yield. Anyway, what this basically shows is all the different ways in which biochar is offsetting the climate change. And the main one is this sort of sparkly blue one in the middle, or aqua one. That is the actual carbon that we've been talking about. The storage of carbon is in biochar. This cross-hatched area is the increase in soil organic matter. This is over a course of 100 years, mind you. And then up here, we have things like, if you're making energy from it, you can get a fossil, when you're offsetting fossil fuel, you can get some credits there, and some other minor things dealing with the other greenhouse gases that are released. But there's also stuff below the line. And part of it is just in some of that biochar carbon is oxidized. That's this black here. And then there is some loss just from removing residues. Instead of leaving them to decompose in the soil, you're taking them and diverting them to biochar. So it's the net between this increase in soil organic carbon due to biochar addition, but you also see a decrease there due to residues. And then there's, of course, just decay of biochar over time. But these two gray areas are ones that we finally get the sense that, at least in Washington State, you're slightly to the good on that. There's going to be more carbon stored in your soil organic carbon, after you've added biochar than there would have been otherwise. The things that determine how much offset you can get, and this is sort of wrapped up for the whole state, but this is a large number here. It's 500 million metric tons of carbon equivalent over the course of a century. And but this depends on how much harvested feedstock you have available. Washington has a lot of trees, and Montana does too. So for like forest thinning operations to prevent wildfires and things like that, that would be a suitable feedstock. Getting rid of Russian olive trees and cedar trees where you don't want them in, say, the Yellowstone Valley would be another option. Anyway, so supply of feedstock is very important. Obviously in the Golden Triangle, then there's going to be a lot more wheat straw and other things like that that can be used. But the carbon efficiency of biochar production is also very important. With carbon efficiency, I mean, how much of the carbon in the original biomass ended up over here in the biochar? How much just went back into the atmosphere? So that varies very much depending on the process. And that's an important thing. And then the carbon quality of the biochar itself, which is, of that carbon, how stable is it to oxidation and being released? In other words, how much of it's going to come off as biochar oxidation and go back into the atmosphere? How fast will that happen? And that's basically determined by how far to the right. The higher the temperature that you make it at, the higher the quality of that biochar. Anyway, in Washington State, we found that somewhere between 8 and 19% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the whole state could be offset by biochar production at maximum production rate. I imagine here in Montana that it would be a much larger percentage because we have a lot, we have a lot of feedstock here. And I think we could, maybe, I'm just throwing a number out there, maybe a third or half of the greenhouse gas emissions in Washington State or in Montana could be offset by biochar. I'd like to do that study. But most of this, at least in Washington State, is just this accumulation of carbon. All right, so enough climate stuff. You can tell what attracts me to biochar, at least initially, was the climate aspects. But as I mentioned, it can be used as a soil amendment. And here's a winter wheat farm in south of Spokane. Some plots where they added lime, they added biochar, and then they didn't add anything. And this is highly acid soil. I mean, it was like less than 4, I think. It was like 3.8 or something. And so you can see most of what we're seeing, if you compare the lime with the biochar, is due to this liming effect of the biochar they were using. But there's some other things, you know, perhaps it improved the water holding capacity. Those pores in the biochar helped it improve the water relations for the crop and so on. And as I mentioned, it has these other things over the longer term. So definitely they saw crop yield improvement here in this particular demonstration. Here's some wheat crops down in Oregon, right near the Washington border, Columbia Basin Ag Research Center. And they had a wheat pea rotation. And the wheat yields went up as they added more biochar. So 3, 4, and 5 have biochar added. So this is 3, 4, and 5. And the pea yields went way up. Peas are much more sensitive to this low pH. In this particular soil, it was a pH of 5, but peas are very sensitive to pH. And so biochar definitely helped in this thing here, where they almost more than doubled the pea yields by adding biochar. So this is an example of where it can work well. It doesn't always have this result, so I'm not going to tell you that it's, you know, always going to make your life better, but it does, it can be helpful.
Jim, I'm so sorry to cut you short. We're at 1 minute to 8. So if folks want to stay past 8 and continue the presentation, I encourage them to, but also want to be mindful of time. Sure.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the beginning, I would rattle on as long as folks would let me. So if you have to leave, that's fine. Shall I continue?
We have a little bit of business to do and setting our next meeting. And so can you jump back in here for people who want to stay on after we set our next
sure.
next meeting?
I certainly can.
All right, great. And so in that light, thanks everyone for being part of this evening. And so we have just jump right into then the next meeting. We have possibly the 15th or the 22nd. Either do those work for everybody, or do we need to do a Google poll or Doodle poll for that? This would be March. And the 15th, they're both Tuesdays.
Either one would work for me.
I could do either one, but I prefer the 22nd.
Can other folks do the 22nd?
They all work for me.
Okay,
hard saying right now, but I'll yield to.
Okay.
Yeah, the 22nd. There's this celebration of the 50th anniversary of Montana's Constitutional Convention. I don't know who all is going to go to that, but that is a something that's happening on the 22nd. I don't need to go to that. So are we, anybody not able to make it to the 22nd? All right, let's do the 22nd then, same time, same station, 6:30 to 8.
All right, so what I was going to show here was just some folks at Iowa State University have done some modeling of what the estimated crop yields would be, enhanced yield. And basically, the more you get green, the more crop improvement you see. So on the eastern coast, in the areas where you have soils with low pH, weathered soils, they estimate significant improvements. You get up in our part of the woods, it's down, 5-8 something like that. It's fairly 8, maybe 10% up here in the Golden Triangle. So in our part of the country, this is mainly probably because we don't have these acid soils so much. You notice here in the Palouse country, the wheat country, it's a little more yellow, so it's a little higher crop yield because they get the liming effect. But I mentioned biochar can add water, and it can double your plant available water holding capacity if you have a very sandy soil, for example. Here's a sand in central Washington with different amounts of biochar added. These are created at different temperatures and so on. But the point is that we started off here, we ended up essentially doubling depending on what type of biochar we added. And the other thing it can do is it can increase water infiltration rate. And this is silty clay loam soil in Iowa. They have a lot of that in the glaciated soils. And you can see here that you get higher infiltration rates with biochar than you would without it. And so obviously, particularly here in Montana, where I am, is we've got the best gumbo you could ever find. And I would think having a good infiltration rate would be a very useful thing to have. So this is an example of another benefit that it can offer. This is a kind of a complicated slide, but I tried to bundle in everything that we kind of know at this point about using biochar as a feed additive for livestock. There's been a lot of claims out there that it improves the health of the animals, it lowers the methane emissions by improving both of those by improving the digestive process. But the fact of what we know is it really depends on what kind of biochar. And you definitely want to avoid chars made from manure. These example, and this is mainly because of mutagenic potential. They can be carcinogenic. And these are a bunch of different chars made from manure that were tested for their mutagenic potential. And this is herbaceous biochar, wood biochar. You see, basically, it's down in the noise. But so that would be the first rule: is just don't take your beef manure and make biochar and feed it back to your cows, because that's not going to help you any. So basically what we do know is you probably want to stick with a wood or a straw char, get high temperature, probably the best. These have a large, in addition to the lack of mutagenicity, they also conduct electrons. It's kind of like graphite, which also conducts electrons. So they can make the efficiency of the digestion process work better. And they have larger pore sizes for colonization by some of the microorganisms that were operating in the gut. And that's where they think they get the benefits, is from this colonization of microorganisms in the biochar. But we have very limited information on this. The studies, a lot of folks have tried to reproduce these studies, and they're getting mixed results. So here's an example of how it affects methane production. And these are basically, if you put urea, you're feeding urea into the animal, produces a fair amount of methane for its nitrogen. But if you add 1% biochar, you get a little bit of a decrease. But if you have this nitrate plus the biochar, you get a huge decrease. And what's happening is nitrate is an oxidant. It's oxidizing the methane and decreasing the overall yield. But long and short of it is that there's much yet to be learned about it. It seems I would not hang my hat on that it will be the next best thing for livestock feed additive. I will not say that it won't either, but just be very careful, and we need to get more research as to what conditions will it decrease methane, what conditions will it actually improve animal health. And at this point, I can't tell you what those conditions are other than my best guesses, which are here. I want to return to what biochar can do for soil organic matter. So in general, the thinking is that soils will saturate at a certain level over time. They have a certain amount of addition of plant residues and microbial decomposed microbes and things like that. And depending on the level of inputs, the moisture content, the temperature, all these different factors that go into making a soil, you'll end up with sort of an equilibrium. And some of it is protected by different mechanisms. So this is sort of the classic theory. Some of it's protected by being stuck to mineral particles, silt and clay. Some of it's protected in aggregates that are formed of these mineral particles stuck together by organic glue. Some of it's biochemically protected by this being recalcitrant and hard for microbes to digest. And then some of it's just non-protected, but because of it just hasn't had a chance to decompose yet. So what we do with biochar is we create a new surface, as I mentioned earlier on. And so we basically say, okay, now you have a new equilibrium. And that is the thinking behind why adding biochar to soil actually will increase soil organic matter. There are some studies. This is one in Western Iowa where they added biochar in 2011. They came back, I think 6 years later and measured it. And this is the change in the carbon that was in the soil. Here's where they didn't add any biochar. They saw a slight change, but here's the change due to adding the biochar itself. And then this is the additional amount that was due to the biochar retaining more of the carbon by the same process that this is retained. And so you see a factor of like, if you compare the red versus the green, a factor of about 3 in terms of the soil carbon stock that was retained as a result of adding biochar. So this is a huge impact to see in just a matter of 6 years. And if you go back to the previous slide, you know, we're on the steepest part of the curve. So we're down here in this normally these things will reach equilibrium in a couple of decades when you have a change in management. So we're down here in the steepest part of the curve, and that's why we're seeing this happen. There's also long-term studies, and this is one in Europe where they looked at old charcoal production sites that were abandoned in about 100 years ago. Or at the most recently 60 years ago, but sometime prior to World War II mostly. And basically they can go in and they can determine of the carbon in the soil, how much of it is biochar, or what we call black carbon, and how much of it is soil organic carbon. And you see with just a little bit of biochar, you get this big increase. And then eventually it saturates at some point and you end up here. But this is a pretty large increase in the soil organic matter content of the soil. And this is over, you know, a century of accumulation. There's several other studies I could show, but just to get the point that this is a very real effect. And I think it's particularly real in the early stages, but it will saturate. It's not like it'll just, you add 10 times as much biochar, you'll end up with 10 times as much soil organic carbon. You'll reach a new saturation level because that's just the way the soil organic matter is. So getting down to the end here is, okay, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, it costs money. And the economic benefits right now don't seem to match up with the prices that it takes to produce it. Basically, $300 to $1,500 a ton of biochar is what people are selling it for. You might get production levels down, you know, so it might be $100, $150 a ton. That might be the cheapest it ever gets. So as a result, capacity exceeds demand because a farmer, even if he makes a 10% yield, unless he's growing a very high value crop, For example, the cannabis farmers are big biochar. We consume a large fraction of the biochar production in this country. And that's because they have a very high value crop and they see a yield increase that more than pays for the cost of it. But if you're growing wheat, it ain't gonna pay the bills. If you're growing vegetables, maybe you're getting into the range where it just depends on where you're getting your biochar and which vegetables and what your soil conditions are. But we need to learn more about matching the type of biochar we add with the soil type. We need to learn how much biochar is needed to get plant growth response. We tend to think of it as a linear response rate. You add X amount of biochar, you get an X increase in yield. Well, in fact, it's much more of a kind of like what we saw in the saturation curve. The first little bit of biochar you add seems to have the greatest impact, and then you have diminishing returns. So don't go and put 50 tons of biochar in your field unless you got money coming out the wazoo, because it's a great place to store carbon if that's what you want to do, and I'm all for that, but make sure you get paid for storing that carbon. But you might start with a ton per acre or something like that, or even less than that, and just experiment with it. We don't know anything about feed supplements. We still need to learn when it works, if and when it works, and what are the reasons for that. So given these prices and so on, there's just a lack of financial incentives right now. We'd like to get carbon credits for it. We're working on it. I think 10 years from now, we're going to have a pretty robust carbon market, but right now it's in its infancy. And if we couple forest thinning operations for fire protection with biochar production and an amendment to crop and range lands, I think that's another area where this thinning would happen anyway. And if you can make biochar out of it and find a good use for it, then you can subsidize the use of it in agricultural operations. But right now, we just don't have the economic wherewithal to pay for it. So I want to return just briefly to the climate and the long-term thing. We'd like to get the atmospheric concentration of CO2 back down to around 350 parts per million, which is about where it was when I was born. But to do that, we're going to have to draw down 1,000 billion tons of CO2 over the next century or two. And right now, we're putting in maybe 40 or 50 billion tons of CO2 a year. So that is, a lot of CO2 that has to come back out. And it just boggles your mind. And that's why we have to spread it out over a century or two. Half of it's in the atmosphere now, but the other half is in the ocean. And the ocean's been taking up CO2 as we keep putting it into the atmosphere. And it's been helping. About half the CO2 that we emit goes into the ocean. It lowers the pH of the ocean, but it prevents it from creating more global warming. But as soon as we start pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, the ocean will release CO2 back to replace that. It's in equilibrium with the atmosphere. And so the fact is that half that was taken out will come back to bite us. And that's why instead of pulling out, we'd only have 500 billion tons we'd have to pull out to get us back down to this safe concentration. We're going to have to pull out twice as much just because it's coming back out of the ocean. We're talking trillions of dollars. And it's going to basically boil down to how much carbon we're emitting before how much we have to offset. And so in my view, we need to put a price on carbon emissions, couple that with incentives for sequestering that carbon. And that is just something we have to do. The biochar is one of those technologies that can do that, as I've referred to. And we think that maximally biochar can draw down about 1/3 of that total amount of 1,000 billion tons. We might get 330 or so as biochar. So we need other things. Building up native soil carbon stocks through regenerative ag, enhanced weathering of basalts, for example. Coupled with those things, we can probably work on getting the rest of that, the other 670 or so. The point being that every carbon drawdown technology that we can think of will likely be needed if we're going to get back into the safe zone. And this is an enormous effort. It's going to take a long time to get there. I hope to see progress in it in my lifetime, but I know we're not going to, it's going to be our grandchildren's lifetime before we're really going to be hopefully seeing serious progress. So I appreciate you letting me ramble on here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So fire away.
Hey,
Well,
Jim.
thanks, Jim.
Oh, sorry.
You go ahead. Go ahead.
Jim, have you used any of this? I noticed the one slide said that it'll take toxic compounds and attach to them. Has any trials been done on that?
Well, we know, yeah, there have been some trials. I know, for example, in the Seattle area, and by toxic compounds here, I'm going to talk about metals. And perhaps you're more interested in the organics. But it will sequester metals. They use it to capture zinc that runs off of galvanized roofing and keep it from going back into Seattle, Puget Sound, and killing the shellfish and things like that. That's definitely well-established technology and being used. I can probably go in the literature and find where it's, I mean, there's been several papers out, I think, showing that it decreases herbicide effectiveness. Or pesticide effectiveness for sure, if you're putting it in the ground. If you're relying on a soil-based system, once it gets in the soil and there's biochar, it will do it. Soil organic carbon does a very similar thing. So it's just, think of it as a supercharged soil organic matter, and whatever the soil organic matter will do, biochar will probably do, and then some. I don't know, does that answer your question enough? I could probably find you some references and send them your way.
You know, I was thinking about that deal in Maine with the biosolids. Would it attach some of those chemicals to the biochar till the fungi could break it down and make it safe again? And if it would help in conjunction with bolstering the fungi, how much would you have to put down? How many tons per acre to see some effect?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to that, other than I can tell you what my gut, my thoughts are, but
that's what, yeah, that's your thoughts. Yeah.
You'd probably want to add a fair amount, and think of it as activated carbon, just like in a tertiary water treatment process. You know, it's the same thing. It's a support for the organisms that are doing the work. So I think the best thing I would do, I'm a big believer in composting, co-composting with biochar. And I think if I were going to take sludge, you know, that kind of thing, I would try to compost it with biochar before I'd put it in the fields and apply it. As far as the amount, it's hard to say. That last picture in the slide, a couple slides before, that's what 10 tons per acre looks like, to give you an idea. That's just on surface applied. So, you know, in the top few inches of soil, 10 tons per acre might be just plenty to do what we need to do. The only reason we stop at 50 is because then we start seeing negative impacts on plant growth. And then there's cost as well. But so, you know, I might play with 5 or 10 tons per acre if I were going to start somewhere, and I'd sure try to co-compost the biochar with the sludge and sort of get that process started ahead of time before I just put it on the soil. But either way, I would think it would have a beneficial impact.
And actually, I didn't say that clear. John sent out an email with that problem they have in Maine, where people did this a lot of years ago, and now their soil's contaminated. I was thinking of a reclamation deal using this. If I
I apologize. I haven't read that email. It's just been so damn busy this week.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
So I'll take a look at that, and then maybe I can answer. I'll just respond on the email, give you guys some thoughts.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
What were the contaminants? Were they metals or were they organics?
It was PFAS, polyfluoroalkyl substances, which I don't know if there's anything that really degrades PFAS, you know.
Yeah. Well, you could pyrolyze it. You heat it up at high temperatures and do that. But yeah, that's a problem. I wouldn't. I don't know that if you find a microbe that degrades it or the fungi, then the trick is getting it where it's in a happy home and it can do its job. And maybe the biochar would do that. I don't know.
When you talk, Jim, about cold composting, what do you mean by that?
Oh, as not cold.
Oh, composting. Okay.
So I didn't put a slide in this, but I've got a great picture of steaming, where they have compost operations, municipal composting and things like that. If they add biochar to that, and I think they may add it on like a 10% basis, something like that, 10% biochar, 90% compost, and mix it all up. It has all kinds of beneficial benefits. It speeds up the composting process. It, as a result, it decreases the overall emissions of greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And it mellows the biochar itself. And so those three things all are good things. And when you're done, you end up with something that goes great in the potting mix. And so that's like most of the biochar in California, that's how it ends up, is in a potting mix of some sort after it's been co-composted. And so it can knock a couple of weeks off a composting cycle, which is typically, I think, 30 to 50 days, something like that. So you can shorten that by up to a couple of weeks by adding biochar.
Right. Well, thanks everybody for sticking around. Thanks, Jim, for the presentation. Get a little deeper into biochar every time. So, and we've got lots of raw material for that,
For sure.
And I'm sure that the standing or even down